A big challenge in large change programs made up of several projects is that they're experienced by the organisation as lots of separate initiatives rather than one coordinated shift. Impacted groups see the fragments of the program that affect them, but they don't always see how those pieces connect to the bigger picture. And when that happens, it can start to feel like lots of constant change without a clear thread running through it. Welcome back to the Applied Change Management podcast. And if you're new here, thanks for joining. I'm Rose. I spent over a decade working in change management and implementation, and now I run Implementation Works, where everything we do is built around a practical, applied way of delivering change. Today, I want to talk with you about how to build an effective change story to support you, your program, and your impacted group. A multi-project program is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a group of projects delivered under one program together. A challenge that we have with that is that quite often those projects being delivered as part of a whole tend to start working in silos. They tend to start to focus just on their own project delivery, which is why multi-project programs often feel fragmented. The reason that happens is that every project has its own objectives, its own timelines, and sometimes it even has its own sponsors. The project team really focuses on those objectives and they're really excited about them, and so they want to go out and tell the organisation what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to happen. Organisations also have different business units and or different functions, and if left to their own devices, then leaders of those will quite often only talk about the pieces of change that affects their area. Rather than talking about the entire programme, they only focus on the change that impacts their function or their business unit. Now that can obviously cause a problem downstream or upstream because people don't understand the entire story of why the change is needed. When that happens, it adds fragmentation to the programme information, which doesn't help anyone. When projects are spoken about individually within programmes instead of as a whole, people experience them as separate hits rather than one coordinated shift. So even if one programme has got 7 projects, each bringing a slight change, it still needs to be delivered as one coherent story. Otherwise, those small changes land one by one, and change saturation becomes a real issue very quickly. Now, that especially happens if all the projects who are so excited to tell the organisation what they're doing send out a newsletter for every project. I've been involved with programs where all the individual projects actually sent out monthly newsletters, and quite a lot of the time, that was actually impacting the same group of people. So if you're in one role, for instance, let's say you're an engineer, and you get 7 individual project newsletters a month, and they all look different, how are you supposed to see the thread? So what happens is, at a program level, without a good change story running across the entire program, it starts to feel like completely disconnected activities. People are left trying to connect the dots for themselves. They're busy with their routine working lives, and we can't expect them to piece together 7 different project messages to understand where the organisation is actually heading. When no one's taking their time to really put it together for them and deliver it to them in a way that's meaningful to them in their role, but also so they can understand where the organisation's going, that's when we get change fatigue. Competing priorities grow and change saturation becomes a real issue. So what a good change story really does is connect programs and projects to the organisation's purpose. There is often a long-term strategy for organisations and areas within the organisations, which I've spoken about in other podcasts, and a change story needs to link to that. A change story also explains why this is happening now. It might be happening now because there are market changes that the organisation needs to adapt to, or it might be happening now because there's been an organisational shift. But either way, the change story needs to tell people why they need to consider these changes and how they can prepare. A good change story also clarifies what's going to be different at the end as much as possible. We need to be able to articulate for people what they can expect from their routine daily working lives when the changes have been implemented, and also what's going to happen while the changes are being rolled out. I've spoken in another podcast about the importance of line managers and how they translate the impact or project to their team's daily routine lives. I've said before that senior leaders tell you where you'll be in 3 years' time as an organisation, but line managers tell you what needs to happen on Monday. A good change story helps those middle managers or line managers translate exactly what's coming for their teams and therefore how they can prepare for Monday. Constructing a good change story takes a lot of collaboration and a lot of work. I want to make it clear that it's not really a marketing exercise, even though we will go out to the organisation as a marketing campaign. What it starts as is an alignment exercise across lots of different levels in the organisation. As change leads, what we can start with are 5 anchor questions. The first question is, what problem are we genuinely trying to solve at program level? That means there must be a reason for this change. There must be a business case that's described that there's a problem that we're solving. And what we need to identify is what is that problem that we're genuinely trying to solve. The second question is, what's going to be materially different for the organisation at the end? What that means really is, what's this going to look like? Is there a new tool that's come in? Is there a new process that's going to be implemented? And how is that going to look for the individuals and for the organisation? The third question is key, and it's something that people in change rarely ask very often, but it's something that people want to hear. What stays the same? It's really important to highlight to people that even though their organisation is changing something again, they're bringing in another tool, they're bringing in another process, there is another change, it's really important to highlight some of the stability for them as well, because they feel overwhelmed just by the sheer number of changes happening in the organisation. And the fourth question is really, what trade-offs are we making? There's always an impact on the organisation whenever a change is made. That can be a dip in performance. It might actually be that staff will be made redundant, or it could be that the tool we want to bring in isn't quite ready yet. The message from the project team might be that they're bringing in a minimal viable product, and there'll be a short-term pain before we can use the fully functioning tool. We need to be transparent about the trade-offs. They will be spotted by the people in the organisation, and so being upfront puts us in a better position. The fifth question is, why is it happening now? Has something changed in the market? Is there something that's shifted within the organisation? Is it that a new leader has come in and seen some streamlining possibilities? Whatever the reason is, that has to be delivered really quite clearly to the impacted group, because without it, and without being a solid reason why, people are really not going to accept the change. Once we have those 5 questions answered, then we can start mapping the project outcomes. But instead of listing the project outcomes or milestones individually, what we need to do is bring it together and describe the capability that's being built into the organisation with the delivery of all these projects as one. We need to talk about the behaviour shift that's needed and the risk which is being reduced. Importantly, we need to talk about any kind of value that's being unlocked by this, because people are going to go through a change and it's going to affect how they work and it's going to disrupt their routine. So we need to be very clear with them on why we're doing it and the value it's going to provide directly to them or indirectly by adding value to the organisation that they work for. Then what we need to do is simplify the story. But if it takes 15 slides to explain this story, then it really is not a story yet. A really strong change story for a program should really be explained in maybe 3 to 5 core themes: a before, during and after story arc, and a very clear end state description that people can actually understand. When it comes to what good looks like with a change story, people really have to recognise themselves in the story. A good, strong program change story really should result in one consistent narrative used across all the projects within that program and a really, really clear articulation of the end state that anyone in the organisation can understand. It needs to be really clear on the expectations that the leaders in the organisation and the program leads have on any behaviour change that we need to see. Crucially, it really is the visible link between project activity and business value with that strategic approach that I spoke about earlier. A good change story reduces duplication of messaging and work, and it supports leaders when they're talking about the program. So no matter which function or business unit within the organisation they sit in, they can fully articulate what it means for their function and business unit, but crucially, the whole and holistic change story that you've shared with them. Practically, what it might look like is that you have a 1-page narrative summary or visual roadmap that shows the themes across the change story. It might be a small collection of slides that show people the whole picture and how it affects them and their colleagues. Change stories can be in whatever format works for you in your organisation. The important thing is to keep it simple, transparent, and consistent and easy for everyone to understand. Never, as a change manager, try to write this change story alone. It is always a collaborative effort. Remember, the project teams know more than you do about the projects in the programme. You're the change expert, not the expert on the deliverables. There are a few people you need to collaborate with to get an effective change story. So you need to work with the executive sponsor and you need to work with them to get the strategic intent of why we're delivering the programme. You also need clarity from them on the political reality of the organisation at the moment. In other episodes, I've spoken about the roles of senior leaders and the strategic role that they hold. It's their key responsibility to see what's happening out there in the world and to translate that political reality to how that will affect the organisation, the people in it, and how we need to adjust and change to make sure that it survives the current climate. The executive sponsor also needs to be very clear on any non-negotiables. So these are the slightly painful changes that just have to happen in organisations sometimes. An example of that can be we may need to reduce the number of people working in a department. It could also be an organisational change that makes people feel uncomfortable because their network is being disrupted around them, even if there are no job losses. Either way, it's important that the executive sponsor is quite clear on the decisions that have been made and that they support the change story in explaining the why firmly but fairly and based in reality. We also need to speak to the programme director or the programme lead. These people really understand the programme in detail. Even though they might not be fully involved in the projects within the programme, they have an excellent insight into things like interdependencies between projects or perhaps the phasing of the implementations that are going to happen. It might be that project 1 is dependent on the implementation of another, and project 2 can't be phased into the organisation or implemented before project 1 is completed, so they can provide sequence logic as well as the phasing. You also need to work with project leads or project managers. They really have the boots on the ground truth on the impact of what their project is going to bring. The project managers can tell you exactly what's changing and for what roles. They can give you a really realistic view on the change load that's coming, and they can talk about what the implications are operationally from the individual projects. Just remember that the project leads are the true experts on what's happening within their individual projects. Don't expect them to be able to help you link all of this up into one larger change story. That's your role in this. If you have the opportunity to speak to subject matter experts from the impacted group, then that's a great opportunity to take. Speaking with them about the impact of the change on their day-to-day can also give you a really good narrative, and so that when people hear the change story, they feel like it's written for them. Once you've collected all the information and put together your story, then you need to work with the communications team. It might be that you're the communications lead as well as the change lead. If that's true for you, then find a partner to work with. This stage is about keeping the tone right and the language consistent. So now that you've got your change story, the next step is to embed it into the organisation. A change story isn't a one-off launch or a short-term campaign. It needs to appear as a visible thread through everything the programme does, and it needs to be heard at all levels in the organisation. You also need to really embed the story into how you work within the programme. That means that you need to embed the story into your project dashboards, into your status reports, into your steering decks, and into your onboarding materials. One way to think about it is, if a person joined the organisation mid-programme, are they going to understand why the programme exists, where it's going, and what it means for them? What I want you to take away from this episode is that storytelling is a huge part of the change management process. You need to make it really applied to the change that people are going to see in the organisation and how it's going to feel for them daily after that change has happened and while the change is being implemented. If you'd like a list of the questions that we bring to Kickstart Change Stories, then hop on over to implementationworks.com, and under podcasts and materials, you'll find our short list of questions. I hope it's helpful to you. Thank you for listening to the Applied Change Management podcast. If you found this week's episode helpful, please follow, like, comment, and share it within your network, and come back next week for more applied change management topics. I'll see you then.